Hello, my name is Arlindo Chagas. Welcome to the channel, The Noble of Horror Stories, Encounter of Fear. Before we start this spine-chilling story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel to help us continue bringing you more scary tales like this one. Now, get ready for a story that will make you think twice before being alone at home. Raphael was a young man who always prided himself on being rational. He worked as a programmer, loved solving logical problems, and despised anything that couldn't be explained by science. So, when he moved into an old apartment in the city center, the stories about the building didn't scare him. The older residents spoke of strange noises, flickering lights for no reason, and a feeling of being watched. Raphael just laughed and said they were just stories to scare children. However, the first night in the apartment brought an unease he couldn't explain. The place was too quiet, and he felt a presence, something invisible but oppressive. Trying to ignore it, Raphael focused on organizing his things and, exhausted, went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, feeling watched, until he finally fell asleep with a heavy feeling on his chest, as if something were pressing down on him. On the second night, something strange happened. Raphael was in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, when he heard a low, almost imperceptible sound, as if someone were whispering his name. He stopped, looked around, but he was alone. The sound seemed to come from the mirror. He approached, staring at his own reflection, and heard it again, this time more clearly. Raphael. His body froze, but he quickly pulled himself together. It must be my imagination, he thought. Yet a part of him knew that something wasn't right. Raphael laughed nervously, turned off the light and went to bed, trying to push away the growing sense of fear. In the nights that followed, the whisper continued. Every time he was in the bathroom brushing his teeth, the mirror seemed to come to life, calling him by name. Raphael tried to ignore it, but the whisper became more insistent, almost pleading to be heard. Each night, the voice became clearer, more desperate. After a week, Raphael was on the verge of a breakdown. He avoided looking in the mirror, barely slept, and the feeling of being watched only worsened. On a particularly cold night, he decided he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Armed with a crucifix that his mother insisted he take, he stood in front of the mirror. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling, his heart racing. To his surprise, the mirror began to fog up slowly, as if a cold breath was coming from the other side. Raphael stepped back, horrified, as words began to form on the surface. "Help me!" He ran out of the bathroom, almost tripping over his own feet. He locked himself in the bedroom, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The image of the fogged-up mirror wouldn't leave his mind. Who was asking for help? And why? That night, Raphael had terrible nightmares. He dreamed of a woman with long, disheveled hair, with empty eyes, who watched him from within the mirror. She was trapped, and she reached out toward him, begging to be freed. He woke up in a cold sweat, the image of the woman etched in his mind. Determined to find out what was happening, Raphael began researching the building's history. What he found made his blood run cold. Decades ago, a woman had been brutally murdered in her own apartment, the same apartment where Raphael now lived. The killer was never found, and the woman's body was discovered weeks later, already decomposing, hidden behind a false wall in the bathroom. Raphael realized that the mirror where he heard the whispers was installed exactly where the body had been found. The woman was trying to communicate with him, seeking justice, or perhaps revenge. He knew he couldn't just run away. He needed to do something to free the woman's soul, or she would haunt him for the rest of his life. Raphael contacted a priest who agreed to perform a blessing in the apartment. On the night of the blessing, the atmosphere in the apartment was heavy, almost suffocating. The priest began to pray, sprinkling holy water on the walls. Everything seemed calm until he reached the bathroom. When the holy water touched the mirror, it shattered into thousands of pieces, revealing the woman from Raphael's dreams. She was clearer, more real, and her empty eyes fixed on his. Raphael fell to his knees, feeling the weight of terror overtaking his body. The priest continued to pray, and the woman began to dissipate slowly, like mist being blown away by the wind. But before disappearing completely, she left one final message in Raphael's mind. "You freed me, but now you're marked." Since that night, Raphael abandoned the apartment and never looked at a mirror the same way again. He lives in constant fear, feeling that at any moment the woman might return to claim what she believes is hers by right. Namely, sometimes what we cannot see can be much more dangerous than we imagine. It all began in a small town surrounded by a dense forest. Lucas, a young explorer, often ventured into the woods, something he had done since childhood. He always loved the silence and solitude that the forest provided. But that day, something was different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a quiet that made the atmosphere heavy. The trees, once welcoming, now stood tall like menacing giants, and the path he knew so well seemed darker. Lucas strayed from his usual route, driven by a strange curiosity. As he ventured deeper, a sense of unease grew within him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something inside told him to turn back. Yet his adventurous spirit urged him forward. As night fell, the forest grew even more sinister. The wind howled through the trees, and shadows danced around him. Then, in the midst of the oppressive silence, Lucas heard something that froze his blood. A soft, melancholic voice calling his name. "Lucas," the voice echoed, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of someone he knew, but it felt disturbingly familiar, as if it had been waiting for him. He stopped in his tracks, looking around, but saw nothing. The voice called again, this time closer. "Lucas, come closer." His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to rationalize what he was hearing. Maybe it was just the wind, he thought, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Despite his fear, something compelled him to follow the voice. He moved slowly, carefully, towards the direction it was coming from. The deeper he went, the darker the forest became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches like twisted arms ready to grab him. The path beneath his feet grew uneven, and the air turned colder with every step. The voice continued to guide him, its tone becoming more urgent, almost desperate. "Lucas, please, I need you." Finally, he reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, decaying cabin, half hidden by the overgrowth. The voice was now coming from inside. Lucas hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to run. But something powerful, almost hypnotic, pulled him forward. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of rot. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the walls seemed to close in around him. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw a figure sitting in the corner. It was a woman, or at least what was left of one. Her clothes were tattered and her hair hung in matted clumps. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but Lucas could see that her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice now weak and broken. "You came. I've been waiting." He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as a wave of terror washed over him. This wasn't a living person. It was something else, something trapped between life and death. "I need you to help me," the woman pleaded. "I can't leave this place, not without you." Suddenly, Lucas felt a cold hand grasp his wrist. He looked down and saw that her fingers were bony and skeletal, like the hand of a corpse. Panic surged through him, and he yanked his arm away, stumbling backward. "Please, don't leave me," the woman cried, her voice now full of anguish. But Lucas had already turned and bolted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. Lucas ran through the forest, the voice still echoing in his mind, though it grew fainter with each step. He didn't stop until he was out of the woods and back in the safety of his home. But even there, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For days, Lucas was haunted by nightmares of the woman in the cabin. Her empty eyes, her cold touch, they plagued him every time he closed his eyes. He tried to forget, to convince himself that it was all just a bad dream. But the voice, it lingered, whispering in the back of his mind, calling him back to the forest. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Lucas decided to return to the forest. He needed to face whatever it was that haunted him to put an end to the nightmares. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, he retraced his steps, following the same path that had led him to the cabin. The forest was just as dark and foreboding as before, but this time Lucas didn't feel the same fear. Instead, there was a determination, a need to understand what had happened. As he approached the clearing, the voice returned, softer than before. "Lucas, you came back." He entered the cabin, expecting to see the woman again, but it was empty. The air inside was stale and cold, and the place seemed more dilapidated than before, as if it had aged decades in just a few days. He searched the cabin, but there was no sign of her. The only thing he found was a small, worn-out diary lying on the floor. Lucas picked it up and opened it. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with the scribbled writings of someone who had clearly lost their mind. The entries spoke of loneliness, despair, and a longing for freedom. As he read, Lucas realized that the woman had been trapped in the cabin for years, unable to move on, her spirit bound to the place by some terrible force. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and Lucas felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "You found it," she whispered, pointing to the diary. "Now you know. Now you understand." Lucas nodded, though he didn't fully grasp what she meant. The woman stepped closer, her bony hand reaching out to him once again. "Help me," she begged. "Release me from this place. I can't stay here any longer." Without thinking, Lucas reached out and took her hand. It was icy cold, but he held on, feeling a strange connection to her. As he did, the room around them began to change. The walls faded, the darkness lifted, and the forest outside became brighter, more alive. The woman smiled faintly, and for the first time, Lucas saw a glimmer of life in her empty eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and peaceful. "I'm free." With that, she slowly faded away, her form dissolving into a warm light that filled the cabin. Lucas stood there, stunned, as the light enveloped him, bringing with it a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. When Lucas returned home, the nightmares stopped. The voice no longer haunted him, and the forest, once a place of fear, now felt like home again. He often visited the spot where the cabin once stood, now just an empty clearing bathed in sunlight. But even as the days passed, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He had freed the woman's spirit, but in doing so, he had also opened himself up to something else. A door had been unlocked, and now, Lucas knew, he was no longer alone. Name: I know that everything in the forest is what it seems, and it is best not to hear any voices. It was late one night when Sarah decided to finally tackle the job she had been dreading for weeks, cleaning out the basement of her old family home. The house had been in her family for generations, and after her parents passed away, it fell to her to sort through years of accumulated memories, dust, and forgotten relics. The basement was the last place left, and Sarah had avoided it for as long as she could. The basement had always unsettled her, even as a child. It was dark, damp, and filled with a musty smell that never seemed to go away. The creaky wooden steps leading down always made her nervous, and the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling barely illuminated the space. But tonight, Sarah felt an odd determination. She grabbed a flashlight and a box of garbage bags and headed down the stairs. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Sarah shook it, trying to steady the beam. She looked around at the piles of old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten items that cluttered the room. She sighed and began sorting through them, throwing away anything that was broken or too far gone to save. After an hour of work, Sarah was deep into the task when she heard a soft noise behind her. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It sounded like a faint shuffling, as if something was moving in the dark corner of the basement. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight into the shadows, but saw nothing. The noise stopped, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Sarah shook her head, convincing herself that it was just the house settling, or perhaps a small animal that had gotten in. She went back to her work, but the unease lingered, creeping up her spine. A short while later, the noise came again, this time louder. It was unmistakable now. Something was moving in the basement with her. Sarah's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the flashlight. She took a deep breath and walked toward the source of the sound, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She approached an old, heavy wardrobe that had belonged to her grandmother. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, standing against the far wall like a sentinel guarding its secrets. The noise had definitely come from behind it. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but then she steeled herself and reached out to open the wardrobe doors. They creaked open with a groan, revealing only old coats and moth-eaten blankets. But the sound was clearer now. It was coming from behind the wardrobe, not inside it. With a sense of dread, Sarah realized she would have to move the massive piece of furniture. She put down the flashlight and pushed against the wardrobe with all her strength. It resisted at first, but then, slowly, it began to slide. As it moved, Sarah noticed something odd. There was a narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall, just wide enough for someone to squeeze through. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered into the gap. The beam of her flashlight revealed a small, hidden door, partially obscured by dust and debris. It was a door she had never seen before, one she hadn't even known existed. It was old and wooden, with a rusty handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity and fear battled within her, but Sarah couldn't resist the urge to find out what lay behind the door. She grasped the handle and with a creak pulled the door open. Beyond the door was a narrow pitch-black passageway that descended further into the earth. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. But something compelled her to keep going. She took a deep breath and stepped into the passage, the darkness swallowing her whole. As she descended, the passage grew narrower and the air colder. The walls were lined with rough stone, and the floor sloped downward at a steep angle. The sense of unease that had been nagging at Sarah now grew into full-blown terror, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had to know what was down there. Finally, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The walls were bare stone, and the only light came from her flickering flashlight. In the center of the room was a large stone slab, like an altar, and on the slab something was moving. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. A figure, small and frail, was curled up on the slab. It was a child, a girl, no older than 6 or 7, her skin pale and her hair matted. She was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned nightgown, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me." Sarah's heart broke at the sight of the terrified child, but as she took a step closer, the girl's expression changed. Her eyes darkened, and a twisted smile spread across her face. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl said, her voice suddenly cold and menacing. Before Sarah could react, the girl's form began to change. Her body twisted and contorted, growing larger and more grotesque. Her skin turned a sickly grey, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The child was gone, replaced by something monstrous, something ancient and evil. Sarah stumbled back in horror, her flashlight flickering wildly. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, and the chamber echoed with the sound. It began to move toward her, its long, clawed fingers reaching out. Panic surged through Sarah as she turned and fled back up the passage. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing thicker and colder. She could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, its growls growing louder. She reached the hidden door and slammed it shut behind her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She pushed the wardrobe back into place, blocking the door, and then ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. When she finally burst into the light of the main floor, she was trembling, covered in cold sweat. She knew she could never go back down there again. Whatever that thing was, it had been waiting, and she had disturbed it. From that night on, Sarah avoided the basement entirely, but she could never shake the feeling that something was still down there, watching and waiting for the next person to uncover its dark secret. The house, once a place of memories and comfort, now felt like a prison, and Sarah knew she could never escape the horror she had unleashed. It is best to find some dated covers. Growing up in the small, isolated town of Blackwood, the forest that surrounded it had always been a source of both mystery and fear. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the curse that plagued Blackwood Forest, a curse that had claimed the lives of those foolish enough to wander too deep into its dark heart. But to the younger generation, these were just stories, meant to keep them from exploring. The danger didn't seem real, until the day one of them didn't come back. It was a cool autumn evening when Jake, along with his best friends Emily and Ryan, decided to venture into the forest. They had heard the tales all their lives, but like most teenagers, they were eager to prove their bravery, to challenge the unknown. They didn't believe in curses or vengeful spirits. To them, it was just a forest, nothing more. Armed with flashlights, a map, and a sense of adventure, the trio set out just before sunset. The trees loomed tall and thick around them, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. They followed an old, overgrown path that wound deeper into the woods, laughing and joking to keep their spirits up. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mood began to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under their feet and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. After an hour of walking, the path they were following disappeared entirely, swallowed up by the undergrowth. Jake, leading the group, stopped and looked around, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "We must have taken a wrong turn," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe we should head back," Emily suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "It's getting late, and this place is starting to freak me out." Ryan, always the skeptic, scoffed. Come on, we can't turn back now. We haven't even seen anything scary yet. Let's just go a little further." Reluctantly, Jake and Emily agreed, and they pressed on. But with every step, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, their twisted trunks and roots forming strange, almost human shapes in the dark. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Suddenly, the beam of Jake's flashlight caught something ahead, a clearing in the trees. Hopeful that it might lead them back to the main path, they hurried toward it. But as they stepped into the clearing, their hope quickly turned to dread. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and vines. Surrounding it were half-buried stones, each marked with strange, indecipherable symbols. The air was colder here, and the silence was absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "What the hell is this?" Ryan muttered, stepping closer to the altar. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't like this, Jake. We need to leave." Jake was about to agree when they all heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, but it didn't belong to any of them. It was distant, echoing through the trees, yet somehow it seemed to be all around them. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her face pale. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was speaking in a language they didn't understand, the words slithering into their minds like tendrils of smoke. And then, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The stones around the altar shifted, groaning as if under great strain, and the earth cracked open, revealing a gaping hole that seemed to lead down into the very depths of the earth. From within the darkness, a foul stench rose, like something rotting and ancient. Ryan took a step back, his bravado evaporating. This isn't right. We need to..." He never finished his sentence. From the pit, something emerged. A figure, gaunt and skeletal, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. Its flesh was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with sharp, broken teeth. It was draped in tattered, ancient robes, and its hands ended in long, blackened claws. The creature fixed its gaze on them, and with a screech that echoed through the forest, it lunged forward. Jake, Emily, and Ryan scattered, panic seizing them. Jake ran, his heart pounding, the flashlight swinging wildly in his hand. He could hear the creature behind him, its claws scraping against the stone and earth as it pursued them. Emily's scream pierced the air, followed by a sickening thud. Jake didn't dare look back. He ran blindly through the trees, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for relief. The whispering voices were louder now, filling his head, driving him to the brink of madness. He burst out of the trees and onto the old path, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the forest. For a moment, he thought he was safe, but then he heard it, a low growl coming from ahead. He stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. Slowly he turned, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Standing in the path, blocking his way, were more of the creatures. They were identical to the one that had chased them, their eyes glowing in the dark, their mouths twisted into cruel, mocking grins. Jake's mind raced. There was no way out, no escape. The creatures began to close in, their claws scraping against the ground. He stumbled back, his back hitting the rough bark of a tree. He was trapped. The leader of the creatures stepped forward, its burning eyes locking onto Jake's. It reached out with one long, bony hand, and Jake felt a cold, crushing weight settle over him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers in his mind grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, his very sense of self. The last thing Jake saw before the darkness claimed him was the creature's twisted, grotesque face, grinning with a hunger that had waited centuries to be sated. The next morning, a search party from the town found the clearing, but there was no sign of Jake, Emily, or Ryan. All that remained were the ancient stones and the crumbling altar, now silent and still. The curse of Blackwood Forest had claimed 3 more lives, and the whispers in the woods continued to wait for the next to come. Raven's Hollow was a place few dared to visit after dark. The small, forgotten town had been abandoned for decades, its history buried beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. What was once a thriving community had been reduced to a ghost town, its streets empty, its buildings crumbling, and its secrets well hidden. But the most unnerving thing about Raven's Hollow was the lights. Strange, flickering lights that appeared in the windows of the old houses at night, despite the town having no electricity for years. For as long as anyone could remember, the lights had been a mystery. Some said they were the spirits of the townsfolk, still going about their lives as if nothing had changed. Others believed they were a warning, a sign to stay away from the cursed place. But no one had ever stayed long enough to find out. That was until Mark, a young paranormal investigator with a thirst for the unknown, decided to uncover the truth. Mark had heard the stories, seen the grainy footage from those brave enough to venture close. But he wanted more. He wanted proof. Proof that something beyond the natural world existed in Raven's Hollow. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a healthy dose of skepticism, Mark arrived at the edge of the town just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a lone bird. As he stepped onto the main street, his footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the quiet. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows dark and lifeless. Mark kept his flashlight low, sweeping the beam across the cracked pavement as he made his way deeper into the town. He had a plan: set up his camera in the center of the town square and wait for the lights to appear. It was simple, methodical, exactly how he liked it. But as he reached the square, a sense of unease settled over him. The town felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ignoring the growing knot of dread in his stomach, Mark set up his camera on a tripod, positioning it to capture as much of the town as possible. He then pulled out a notebook, jotting down the time and conditions. It was a routine he had done countless times before, but this time felt different. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. The town was unnervingly still, as if frozen in time. But then, just as Mark was beginning to doubt the stories, he saw it, a faint flicker in one of the windows of the house directly in front of him. He blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but there it was again, stronger this time, a soft, yellowish glow, as if a candle had been lit inside the house. Mark's heart began to race as he grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the window. The light inside seemed to pulse in response, growing brighter and then dimming, as if beckoning him closer. Without thinking, Mark found himself moving toward the house. The door was ajar, creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The smell of damp wood and rot assaulted his senses, but he pressed on, his curiosity overpowering his fear. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. The glow was coming from a room at the end of the hallway, and as he approached, he could hear something, faint, almost imperceptible, a whispering, like many voices speaking at once. Mark's pulse quickened. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The room was small, empty save for a single chair in the center. The light was coming from a small lantern on the floor, its flame flickering wildly as if caught in a strong wind. But there was no wind, nothing but the still, suffocating air of the old house. He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the lantern. The whispering grew louder, but the words were still indistinct, jumbled together like a chorus of lost souls. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the voices were coming from the very walls of the house, as if the building itself were alive, speaking to him. His hand shook as he reached for the lantern, and as soon as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the room was plunged into darkness. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Mark fumbled for his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally managed to turn it on, the beam revealed something that hadn't been there before, a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, her clothes tattered and stained. Her eyes, hollow and empty, locked onto Mark's, and she began to move toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. The air around her seemed to warp and twist, distorting her form as she approached. Mark stumbled back, his mind racing. He pointed the flashlight at her, but the light did nothing to stop her advance. She raised a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, and as she reached out to him, Mark felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if the very air had turned against him. The woman's fingers brushed his arm, and in that instant, a flood of images surged into his mind. Flashes of the town as it once was, vibrant and full of life, followed by images of death, decay, and despair. He saw the townsfolk, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes empty, just like the woman's. They were trapped, their souls bound to the town, cursed to wander its empty streets for eternity. Mark's vision blurred, his strength waning as the woman's grip tightened. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was her face, no longer shadowed, but clear and terrifyingly familiar. It was his own face staring back at him with hollow eyes. When the search party arrived the next day, all they found was Mark's camera, still recording. The footage showed him walking into the house, but then the screen went black. His notebook was untouched, his flashlight still on the ground where he had dropped it. There was no sign of Mark, no trace of where he had gone. The lights in Raven's Hollow continued to flicker on, night after night, and the town remained as silent and empty as ever. The curse had claimed another, and the whispers in the walls waited for the next soul, foolish enough to venture into the darkness. If you hear these regrettable stories, they are worthy of tanning and are eager to support the channel.